Hi folks, welcome to Chapter 4, our video on the components of a compensation strategy. So in this chapter, we're going to define what base pay actually is because it's one of the components of compensation. We're going to discuss a little bit about its advantages, disadvantages, and applicability to certain situations. As well, we're going to discuss another component of compensation, which is performance pay. In the same vein, we'll discuss base pay, advantages, disadvantages, and applicability. And we'll do it with indirect pay. That's your healthcare benefits, your pensions, those kinds of things. We're going to differentiate between three main methods for establishing base pay. And one of those methods is market pricing, and we'll discuss advantages and disadvantages of that. Job evaluation, which is again one of the other three main methods for establishing base pay. And then we'll also look at pay for knowledge and skill systems and look at their advantages and disadvantages, as they are another way to establish compensation. Now, if we start looking specifically at a compensation strategy, how do we know how to actually design it? So we're HR professionals, we need to put in a compensation strategy. You need to think about, first of all, what role should base pay, performance pay, and indirect pay, so that's your base pay, like your base salary, any performance or incentive pay, and your benefits and pension play in the mix. So is it going to be a third, a third, a third? Do we want it to be motivating? Do we want people to demonstrate membership behavior and stay with us for a long period of time? What is it that our compensation system is going to do? Because don't forget, at the heart of it, we said in the first three chapters all the way through so far, a compensation system has to be motivating, right? So we need to make sure it's motivating not just for the employees, but it's also cost effective, so we know what total level of compensation should be provided, and it's going to help the organization achieve its outcomes. You remember that we said that in terms of compensation, 40 to 70% of any employer's operating budget is probably compensation based. So we need to look at how much can we afford and what's the mix of these three components that we're going to offer employees, all the while making sure it accomplishes corporate goals as well as is motivating to the employee. So let's start talking about the three choices that we have for compensation. Again, we talked about base pay, performance pay, and indirect pay. And again, this graphic is kind of neat because it tells us what are the elements that we can consider if we're formulating a compensation strategy that might be part of our base pay. Well, most organizations evaluate jobs internally to make sure they have what we call internal equity. Some of those job evaluation systems you may be familiar with. The Hay system is probably one of the most popular ones. But many times, job evaluation systems can be homegrown or made by a company, devised to evaluate jobs internal to the company. And you can do that with the help of a consultant, because many consulting firms actually have packages that you can purchase that can be customized to you so that you can evaluate jobs. Another reason why companies evaluate jobs is not just to maintain internal equity, but many companies have to fall under the rules and regulations for pay equity. And pay equity, as many of you may have studied in your human resources management course, is something whereby employers have to make sure that female-dominated job classifications, where they're thought to be equal in terms of skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions to those as male-dominated jobs, are paid fairly. So we need to make sure that we have a system through job evaluation that identifies those jobs that need to be paid equitably to those of male-dominated job classes. So we also want to, in our base pay, look at market pricing. So it's not enough to say, well, I need to make sure I have internal equity. What if you have jobs whereby it's really hard to get certain skill sets in? Maybe certain types of skilled trades or engineering jobs. You may need to pay differently or outside of what your internal equity system tells you. So if you're paying $125,000 for an engineer, an electrical engineer, and there's a shortage of electrical engineers, engineers, and most of your competition are in your area, electrical engineers are getting paid $175,000, then you might say, well, even though $125,000 is a fair wage to pay, given what I'm paying other jobs in my organization, again, being mindful of that job evaluation and internal equity, for me to attract good ones, I got to pay more. So we also have to look at the impact that market pricing, particularly on jobs that are in short supply, might have on what you pay people at base. And then pay for knowledge. Pay for knowledge we talked a little bit about earlier on in the course when we looked at LSE galvanizing. Paying people for what they know how to do. That will also be an element that some companies may need to consider, especially if they want to create high involvement organizations. All right, they might need to consider this for base pay. We also have an option to, most companies have an option to offer performance pay. So we can offer people incentives or some performance a boost or bonus if they perform well individually and meet their goals, if their team performs well. And then, as we saw in the opening vignette for some of the banks, like RBC, for example, what they do and what many companies do, not just banks and RBC specifically, but many organizations, they will look at the degree to which the organization as a whole has achieved its corporate objectives and what role your division or you meeting your objectives had to do with it, and then maybe give you a bonus based on that. So some of your performance pay could be based on how well the organization does. Indirect pay, again, is one of those compensation mix items that we always have for employees, or most companies have, and that would look at your mandatory benefits, which are things like Canada Pension Plan, entitlements, because you and your employers contribute to that. Employment insurance, those are what we consider mandatory benefits. A pension plan, if you're a part of it, whether it's defined benefit or defined contribution, your healthcare benefits, vacation, employee services such as EAP programs, and maybe some other benefits that you might have. Flex time might be one, working from home, those kinds of things, telecommuting, those kinds of things that you might have as a perk from your employer, maybe fitness memberships at gyms, those kinds of things. But we look more at indirect pay as we get to the end of the course. And again, there is a specific chapter on performance pay as well. So we will talk about these in a lot more detail. Right now, what we want to do is we kind of want to scratch the surface so you know the kinds of options you have within each one to pay people or to compensate people, and some of the advantages and disadvantages. So now, if we look at our compensation mix, which looks at incorporating base, indirect, and performance pay, we know that performance pay, some of our data now tells us that 5 to 10% of a corporation's compensation is performance pay. Indirect pay is about 15% of total compensation, and again, this is across Canada and it's general. It takes into account all kinds of different companies, even not-for-profits where that information is available. But base pay, you can see in most organizations, accounts for approximately 75 to 80%, all right, of an employee's compensation package. So that's still quite significant, all right? But some companies, depending, could provide 100% base, 100% performance pay. But many times what companies do, they might perform 100% or allow a person, say for example, to have 100% performance pay. That might be an option they have. So say for example, I'm hiring for a sales job. I might decide, well, hey, I want to give my salespeople an option to go 100% commission or 100% performance, right? Commission plans are an example. Or maybe take a $20,000 a year base and then earn the balance on commission. This is sometimes a popular arrangement to make for people who are new to an organization and maybe new to a sales environment as well. So it really depends on the company and how they want to put that into place. But sometimes we determine what compensation mix is appropriate based on the jobs. Maybe for salespeople, this mix isn't appropriate for an organization. Okay, maybe an organization might say, well, a salesperson, maybe this is going to be flipped. Maybe for a salesperson, it's going to be 80% performance and, maybe 10% base or 5% base and 15% indirect pay. Depends, right? So a lot of times this data is taken by, by companies, but a lot of companies might have different compensation mix for different types of jobs, depending on, you know, how the level of membership behavior, task behavior that they want to cultivate in their employees. So now, let's look at this fundamental components of each element of the compensation mix. So the first element is base pay. Wages are usually associated with hourly workers, and salary with our workers that are salaried, or they get a particular base pay that doesn't change, maybe office professional workers. So base pay is quite common because it's easy to measure, right? It's easy to measure. I know how much I'm paying you. It's easy to price in terms of its value to the employer, right? So I can look at the market. What's the market paying for administrative assistants in my area? And again, I'm going to pay that. So it's easy to price in terms of its value to you as an employer, but to other employers in the area that are competing for the same kinds of people. It's easy to attribute to individual employees. So it's easy for me to say, okay, Joe Brown, you are earning $50,000 a year. You are an intermediate accountant, right? And that's what I'm paying you. And that's what I pay most of my intermediate accountants. So it's easy to attribute to an individual employee, and it's also controllable by individual employees. So for example, when we talk about being controllable, sometimes organizations at the end of a quarter or the end of a year will sit down and do a performance review on you, and you have an opportunity through merit pay systems to earn a little bit more, maybe a 3% or 5% pay increase, right? So if I get a 5% pay increase and I'm earning $50,000 a year, now I've just earned another $2,500, so now my base pay is $52,500 a year. So the idea is, based on the performance level of employees, they can determine how big that increase is going to be. But it is relatively stable. So in other words, if a company says, well, I can only afford to give X percent of my payroll as base pay, then again, I can kind of control that. So it's not just controllable by individual employees, it's also controllable so that it can be, base pay can be considered relatively stable to the employer. It's also stable for the employee because now the employee knows exactly the size of the take-home pay that they're getting, right? So if you look at it from that perspective, it's also stable from the perspective of the employee. So the employee now knows how much money they're getting. And there's a certain level of comfort in that too. And again, we look back to Hertzberg's two-factor theory that we talked about, that could be kind of a hygiene factor, right? Knowing how much money you're getting. It may not be enough to motivate great behavior, but if you didn't provide that same level of income and people have designed a lifestyle based on it, guess what? It can become very dissatisfying and demotivating to people. So you have to consider this too in terms of the theories of motivation to know how much is the right thing for you to offer your employees. If we look at the advantages and disadvantages of base pay, well, we know base pay is a little more flexible. It can encourage job behaviors because you're assessing performance and getting that pay increase or that merit increase, which is going to increase your base pay based on demonstrating certain behaviors. It can also signal the relative importance of jobs. Again, many times the way you're paid is determined based upon the number or how your job evaluates out, right? In the internal system. So your job evaluation can also determine how much you're being paid, and that gives us like a hierarchy of jobs, right? Demonstrates a commitment. So again, employees know their employer is committed to paying them that amount, and it supports what we would call a particular managerial strategy. So base pay usually satisfies classical and human relation strategy, and it is pretty simplistic. Disadvantages: it could be linked to variability in an employer's ability to pay. So for example, if profits are down, an employer might say, well, on average, we've given 4.5% base pay increases. We can't do that in this economy. Maybe it's going to be zero. Maybe it's going to be 1%. So again, if the employer can't pay, then your base pay may not go up as much as you wanted it to. It doesn't really directly motivate any task behavior. So just because you're paid more, it doesn't mean that the job is going to be so much more satisfying that you're going to be more motivated to do it. And again, it doesn't contribute to citizenship behavior either. So in other words, it doesn't make you want to go out of your way to do over and above for the company. It's not self-correcting, meaning that once you've committed and you've given it, it's with extreme difficulty and perhaps some legal battles that you can't take it away as an employer. It becomes a little more challenging to do that, so it's not self-correcting. So in other words, say I'm that $50,000 intermediate accountant, right? And I get my 2.5% or my 5% pay increase. Now I'm earning $52,500. If I perform poorly, I might get no increase. I might get a smaller increase than 5%, but the idea is it's not normal that most companies would take away any of that $52,500. So in that sense, it's not self-correcting. Once it's out there, it's out there. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit more about performance pay, but I'm going to do this in a separate video because I want to try and control the length of the videos. So I'm going to begin performance pay in a separate video. So stay tuned. Part 2 is just around the corner.